The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Cheryl Dorsey walked home from school, her backpack heavy with books but her mind heavier with thoughts. At just 13, she already understood the unspoken rules of her neighborhood. When police cars cruised slowly down her street, conversations hushed, eyes lowered, and everyone seemed to hold their breath until they passed. That afternoon, she witnessed something that would stay with her forever. 2 officers had stopped her neighbor, Mr. Washington, an elderly man who had lived on their block for decades and often shared fresh vegetables from his garden. They had him pressed against his car, demanding identification while he tried to explain he was just unloading groceries. Cheryl stood frozen at the corner, watching the humiliation on his face, the frustration, the resignation. Later that night, she overheard her parents discussing it in hushed tones in the kitchen. "Nothing changes if nothing changes," her father had said, his voice a mix of anger and exhaustion. Those words planted themselves in Cheryl's mind like seeds. 25 years later, those seeds had grown into purpose. Dr. Cheryl Dorsey pulled her car into the parking space at the Public Safety Commission building. Smoothing her blazer before gathering her portfolio, the weight of her service medals felt familiar against her chest, reminders of her military years that had shaped her discipline and determination. Growing up in Westfield hadn't been easy. It was a neighborhood where police were seen more as threats than protectors, where career options seemed limited, and where few expected a young black girl to aim high. But Cheryl had been blessed with parents who believed education was the key to breaking cycles. Her mother, a hospital administrator, and her father, a high school physics teacher, created a home where questions were encouraged and learning celebrated. "People fear what they don't understand," her mother would say, "and they disrespect what they fear." Break that cycle, baby. Cheryl had taken those words to heart. She'd thrown herself into her studies, earning scholarships that helped her become the first in her family to attend university. Her decision to join the military after graduation had shocked everyone, especially her father, who had served in Vietnam and returned with both physical and invisible scars. "I need to understand the system from the inside," she'd explained. 4 years of military service taught her strategy, leadership, and the complex dynamics of power and authority. When she finally announced her intention to join law enforcement, her parents had been silent for a long moment. "You sure about this path?" her father had asked quietly. "I am," she'd replied. "Nothing changes if nothing changes, right?" The police academy had been its own battlefield. Being one of only 3 women in her class of 30 was challenging enough. Being the only black woman made her a reluctant symbol before she'd even earned her badge. Some instructors seemed determined to see her fail. Fellow cadets alternated between icy distance and uncomfortable curiosity about her perspective. She'd kept her head down, studied harder, trained longer, and graduated 3rd in her class. The early years on the force had tested her resolve daily. Patrol work in neighborhoods similar to where she'd grown up meant navigating complicated tensions. Some community members viewed her as a traitor. Some fellow officers viewed her as an outsider. Finding her balance meant remembering why she'd chosen this path to begin with, not to enforce a broken system but to help transform it. Officer Dorsey approaches community policing differently. Her first sergeant had written in her evaluation, "She diffuses situations others might escalate. We need more of this approach." That evaluation had been the first sign that her methods, while unconventional, were being noticed. When a community liaison position opened, Cheryl jumped at the opportunity. The role allowed her to build bridges, create youth programs, and establish neighborhood watch groups that worked with rather than against local officers. Crime rates in her sectors dropped steadily. Complaints against officers decreased. Small victories accumulated. Graduate school came next. Night classes while working full-time, studying criminal justice with a focus on community-oriented solutions. Her dissertation on reimagining police training had been published and implemented in several departments across the state. Promotions followed, sergeant, lieutenant, captain. With each step up, she gained both supporters and detractors. "You're making waves, Dorsey," her captain had warned after she'd proposed significant changes to the department's use of force training. "Not everyone appreciates that." "With respect, sir, waves change shorelines over time," she'd responded. Now at 42, Dr. Cheryl Dorsey was interviewing for the position of chief of police in Riverdale, a mid-sized department with a troubled history. The city had experienced several high-profile incidents of excessive force, discrimination lawsuits, and community protests. 3 chiefs had come and gone in 5 years. Most of her colleagues thought she was crazy to want the job. "It's a career killer," her mentor had warned. "They need a miracle worker, not a police chief." Maybe that was true, but something about the challenge called to her. Riverdale wasn't so different from where she'd grown up. The same tensions, the same distrust, the same cycles repeating. She'd spent her entire career preparing for exactly this type of opportunity. The interview room was intimidating by design. A long table with 7 commission members seated on one side, their expressions carefully neutral. Cheryl had faced tougher rooms. She placed her portfolio on the table, sat straight, and met their gazes directly. "Dr. Dorsey," the chairwoman began, "your credentials are impressive, but this department needs more than academic theories. We need practical solutions for serious problems." Cheryl nodded. "I understand that perfectly. Theory without application is just wishful thinking. That's why I've brought data from my previous initiatives and their measurable outcomes." She opened her portfolio and began walking them through the community programs she'd established, the training reforms she'd implemented, and the statistical improvements that had followed. Some commissioners leaned forward with interest. Others remained skeptical. "These approaches worked in your previous positions," one older commissioner noted, "but Riverdale has unique challenges." "Every community has unique challenges," Cheryl acknowledged, "but certain principles remain constant. Accountability, transparency, consistent standards applied equally, community involvement in defining public safety. These aren't radical concepts, but they require commitment from the top down." The questions grew increasingly pointed. How would she handle resistance from within the ranks? What specific changes would she prioritize? How would she measure success? Cheryl answered each question thoughtfully, drawing on 20 years of experience and lessons learned from both successes and failures. "Final question," the chairwoman said, after nearly 2 hours. "Why Riverdale? With your qualifications, you could choose a much less troubled department. Why take on this particular challenge?" Cheryl paused, considering how to articulate what drove her. The faces of people from throughout her life flashed through her mind. Mr. Washington from her childhood neighborhood, her parents, the skeptical cadets and officers she'd worked alongside, the community members who'd gradually come to trust her. "I believe Riverdale is at a turning point," she finally said. "This department could continue cycling through leaders, applying band-aid solutions to systemic problems. Or it could become a model for what effective, equitable policing looks like in the 21st century. I've spent my career building the skills needed for this moment. I understand both sides of the divide because I've lived on both sides. I know what's possible when we have the courage to change not just policies but culture." She closed her portfolio and continued, "I'm not offering quick fixes or miracle solutions. I'm offering a vision and the determination to see it through step by step, day by day. Meaningful change takes time, but it starts with choosing a different path forward." As she left the interview, Cheryl felt a strange certainty. Whether they offered her the position or not, she had spoken her truth. She had honored the journey that had brought her here, from that young girl watching injustice on her street corner to the woman she had become. 3 days later, the call came. The commission had voted. The job was hers if she wanted it. "When can you start?" the chairwoman asked. Cheryl looked at the calendar, calculating the time needed to relocate and prepare. 2 weeks, she answered. "But I'd like to request something unusual. I'd like my appointment to remain confidential until I've had a chance to observe the department in its natural state." There was a pause on the line. "That's unorthodox. May I ask why?" "Because sometimes seeing clearly requires fresh eyes," Cheryl explained. "I need to understand this department as it truly is before I can help transform it into what it needs to become." After some discussion, the commission agreed. In 2 weeks, Dr. Cheryl Dorsey would become Chief Dorsey of the Riverdale Police Department. But for a short, crucial time, she would be just another new face in town, watching, listening, and preparing for the work ahead. What she couldn't possibly know was how quickly her unconventional approach would be tested, or how a routine traffic stop would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The commissioners of Riverdale sat in unusual silence after their vote, 6-1 in favor of hiring Dr. Cheryl Dorsey as their new police chief. The decision itself hadn't been difficult. Her qualifications spoke for themselves. What gave them pause was her unusual request to keep the appointment confidential for the first week. "I still don't understand why we're agreeing to this," Commissioner Brennan said, tapping his pen against the table. At 68, he was the oldest member of the commission and the lone dissenting vote. Not because he doubted Dorsey's abilities, but because he believed in transparency above all else. "Because we've tried everything else," Chairwoman Patricia Wilson replied, gathering her papers. 3 chiefs in 5 years, all following the same playbook, all facing the same resistance. "Maybe it's time for a different approach." Mayor Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "The department needs a reset. Dr. Dorsey deserves a chance to understand what she's walking into without preconceptions clouding interactions. 1 week of observation before the official announcement won't hurt anyone." The truth was more complicated than what they discussed openly. Riverdale's police department had deep-rooted problems that went beyond what showed up in official reports. There were factions within the ranks, those who resisted any change and those who desperately wanted reform but feared speaking up. The last chief had tried to push through policy changes too quickly and faced such severe backlash from the old guard that he'd resigned after just 7 months. "We'll need a cover story," Commissioner Lee pointed out. "People will ask questions if she's seen around the station before the announcement." "She suggested handling that herself," the chairwoman replied. "Said something about using her background in community assessment as a consulting role. The paperwork will list her as a temporary consultant until the official announcement." As the meeting adjourned, the weight of their decision hung in the air. Riverdale needed healing, between its police force and the communities they served and within the department itself. They were placing enormous hope on one woman's shoulders. Meanwhile, Dr. Cheryl Dorsey was packing up her apartment across the state. 15 years in one place meant accumulating more than she'd realized. Books on criminal justice reform, leadership, psychology, and community building filled box after box. Awards and certificates she'd never bothered to hang went into a single container. Clothing, minimal and practical, was the easiest to pack. Her neighbor Mrs. Chen knocked on the door, holding a small potted plant. "A housewarming gift for your new place," she explained, handing it over. "It's a peace lily. They're hard to kill even for people who travel a lot." Cheryl smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. I'll try my best not to let it down." "You never told me where you're moving to," Mrs. Chen said, curiosity evident in her voice. "Riverdale," Cheryl replied, setting the plant on her otherwise empty kitchen counter. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows shot up. "Riverdale? Isn't that where they had those police brutality protests last year? The ones that made national news?" Cheryl nodded. "The very same. And you're moving there? Voluntarily?" Her neighbor looked genuinely confused. "Sometimes the places with the biggest problems are where you can make the biggest difference," Cheryl said simply. Mrs. Chen studied her face for a moment. "You're not just changing jobs. You're up to something important." Cheryl smiled but didn't elaborate. Mrs. Chen had always been perceptive. "I'll send you my new address once I'm settled." 2 days later, Cheryl drove into Riverdale with everything she owned packed into her car and a small U-Haul trailer. The city was larger than where she'd grown up, but had the same feeling of a place divided against itself. As she drove through different neighborhoods, the contrasts were stark. Manicured parks and fresh paint in some areas, neglected infrastructure and empty storefronts in others. She'd rented a modest apartment downtown, equidistant from City Hall and the main police precinct. The building was older but well-maintained, with a mix of residents that seemed to represent the city's diversity. Perfect for what she needed, a neutral territory where she could observe without drawing attention. After unloading the essentials and setting up her bed, Cheryl changed into casual clothes and walked to a coffee shop across from the police station. She ordered a black coffee and took a seat by the window, watching officers come and go. Body language told stories that reports never could. Who walked with confidence, who seemed weary, which officers arrived together, and which avoided eye contact with their colleagues. "You must be new around here," the barista commented when she ordered a refill. His name tag read Thomas, that obvious. Cheryl asked with a small smile. "Small downtown area. Most people are either regulars or tourists, and you don't have the tourist vibe." He gestured to her notepad. "Job hunting?" "Something like that," she replied. "I'm doing some community assessment work." "Well, you picked an interesting spot to people watch," Tomas said, nodding toward the police station. Lots of drama across the street these days. Oh? Cheryl tried to sound only casually interested. Department's a mess. No leadership. Half the officers are decent people trying to do right, the other half? He trailed off, glancing around as if checking who might be listening. Let's just say there's a reason people in certain neighborhoods don't call 911 even when they should. Cheryl nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, allowing him to continue. Heard they're bringing in some new chief soon. Another outsider who'll probably quit when it gets tough. He shrugged. Anyway, welcome to Riverdale. Coffee refills are half price before noon. Over the next 3 days, Cheryl established a routine. Mornings at the coffee shop watching the station. Afternoons driving through different neighborhoods. Stopping at community centers, parks, and local businesses. Introducing herself as a community assessment specialist. Gathering information for a city improvement initiative. People spoke surprisingly freely once they believed she had no connection to law enforcement. The police? They show up when something bad has already happened. Never when it might prevent something, said an elderly man tending a community garden in the east side. Some officers are trying their best, a grocery store owner in the West District told her. But they're caught in a system that doesn't work, so what difference does it make? My son is 14, a mother of 3 confided while watching her children at a playground. I've already had to teach him what to do if he's stopped by police. No sudden movements. Yes, sir, no, sir. Hands where they can see them. What kind of world is it when that's as important as teaching him to look both ways before crossing the street? Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle Cheryl was assembling. By night, she organized her notes and prepared for the role she would soon step into officially. On the 4th day, she visited City Hall and met with Mayor Rodriguez under the pretense of reviewing her consulting findings. In reality, they discussed her actual observations and first impressions. It's worse than the report suggested, she admitted. The division within the department is creating a culture of silence. Officers who want to serve properly are afraid to challenge those who abuse their authority. The mayor sighed heavily. Can it be fixed? Yes, Cheryl said without hesitation. But it will require changes that won't be popular with everyone. I'll need your unwavering support when pushback comes, and it will come. You have it, Mayor Rodriguez promised. The commission is prepared for the announcement tomorrow. Your office is ready whenever you want to see it. I'd rather wait until after the announcement. For tonight, I want to drive around once more as just another citizen. That evening, Cheryl decided to visit the North District, an area with both upscale developments and pockets of poverty. The contrast between neighboring streets was jarring. She drove slowly, making mental notes about police presence in different areas. As she turned down Maple Avenue, blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. She checked her speed, 5 under the limit. Signaling properly, she pulled to the curb, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. The cruiser behind her had 2 officers inside. They sat for nearly a minute before the driver's door opened, standard procedure to run her plates before approaching. Cheryl took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was exactly the kind of interaction she needed to understand. She had deliberately driven her personal car with out-of-state plates, knowing it might draw attention. What she hadn't planned was for this routine traffic stop to become the pivotal moment that would define her entire approach to reforming the Riverdale Police Department. As the officer approached her window, flashlight beam sweeping across her face, Cheryl had no idea that tomorrow's headlines were already writing themselves. The officer tapped on her window with 2 knuckles. License and registration, please. Cheryl nodded calmly. May I ask why I was pulled over, officer? Your right taillight is out, he replied, though her car was new and she knew all lights were functioning perfectly. And you were driving unusually slowly through the neighborhood. I see, she said simply, reaching slowly for her documents. I'm new to the area, just getting familiar with the streets. The flashlight beam lingered on her face longer than necessary. The second officer had now approached the passenger side, another standard tactic for traffic stops after dark. What happened next would change everything, not just for Cheryl, but for the entire Riverdale Police Department. Officer Peter Walsh shined his flashlight through the driver's side window, taking longer than necessary to examine Cheryl's face and the interior of her car. His partner, Officer Brian Diaz, stood at the passenger window, hand resting casually near his holster, a stance Cheryl recognized as standard procedure for night stops, though his posture seemed unnecessarily tense. License and registration? Officer Walsh repeated. His tone clipped. Cheryl moved deliberately, narrating her actions as she'd advised countless community members to do during police encounters. I'm going to reach for my purse on the passenger seat now to get my license. She noticed Officer Diaz straighten slightly at her methodical approach. Perhaps he found it suspicious, or perhaps he recognized it as the behavior of someone who had been coached on interacting with police. My registration is in the glove compartment, she continued calmly. Go ahead, Walsh said, watching her every move. She handed over her driver's license, still showing her address from her previous residence, and the car registration. Walsh studied them with a frown. This license is from out of state. What brings you to Riverdale? His tone had shifted, taking on the edge of an interrogation rather than a routine traffic stop. I recently accepted a position here, Cheryl replied truthfully. What kind of position? Walsh pressed. I work in public service, she answered, deliberately vague. Walsh's flashlight beam swept across the back seat where several boxes were visible. Looks like you're just moving in. Kind of late to be driving around unfamiliar neighborhoods, wouldn't you say? Cheryl recognized the implied accusation in his tone, the suggestion that she didn't belong here, especially at night. This was exactly the kind of interaction she'd been studying throughout her career. The subtle ways bias could influence policing. Now she was experiencing it firsthand in the very department she was about to lead. I wanted to get familiar with the area, she explained. I start work tomorrow. Officer Diaz spoke for the first time, his voice carrying through the open passenger window. Walsh, can I have a word? The two officers stepped a few paces away, speaking in hushed tones. Cheryl could only catch fragments. Taillight is fine. Just being cautious. Something doesn't add up. Cheryl sat patiently, hands still visible on the steering wheel. 20 years in law enforcement had taught her that this moment, this seemingly routine traffic stop, revealed more about department culture than any report or interview ever could. She was both participant and observer, experiencing what countless citizens had described to her over the years. Officer Walsh returned to her window. Step out of the car, please. That request raised immediate red flags. There was no legal basis for asking her to exit the vehicle for a supposedly routine traffic stop about a taillight that wasn't actually broken. May I ask why that's necessary, Officer Walsh? She used his name deliberately, noting his slight surprise that she'd caught it from his nameplate. Just a standard procedure, he replied, which they both knew wasn't true. I don't believe that's a standard procedure for a taillight violation, Cheryl countered calmly. Unless you have reasonable suspicion of something else, I'm not legally obligated to exit my vehicle. Walsh's posture stiffened. Ma'am, when an officer gives you a lawful order, is it a lawful order, though? Cheryl interrupted, her tone still respectful but firm. Pennsylvania vs. Mims established that police can order drivers out of their vehicles during traffic stops, but only with reasonable justification. You told me I was stopped for a taillight that we both know is functioning properly, and for driving slowly, which isn't a traffic violation. The change in Walsh's expression was immediate, surprise quickly masked by defensiveness. Civilians who knew their rights were often viewed as threats by officers accustomed to unquestioned authority. Are you an attorney? He asked, suspicion evident in his voice. No, Cheryl replied, but I believe transparency is important in police interactions. Don't you agree, Officer Walsh? Officer Diaz had moved closer, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the stop was taking. Walsh, maybe we should… ID check came back clean, Walsh cut him off. But something doesn't add up here. He directed his attention back to Cheryl. You said you work in public service and you're starting tomorrow. Where exactly? Cheryl considered her options. Her original plan had been to maintain her cover until the official announcement tomorrow. But this situation was providing valuable insight into how these officers conducted themselves when they thought no one was watching. I'll be working with the Riverdale Police Department, she said. Watching their reactions carefully, Walsh's eyebrows rose. As what? We're not hiring any civilian staff that I know of. Not as civilian staff, Cheryl replied, reaching slowly into her jacket pocket. I believe this might clear things up. She withdrew a small leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing her police credentials from her previous department, alongside a letter of appointment signed by Mayor Rodriguez and the Police Commission chairwoman. My name is Dr. Cheryl Dorsey. As of tomorrow morning, I'm your new chief of police. The silence that followed was absolute. Officer Walsh's flashlight beam wavered as his hand dropped slightly. Officer Diaz's mouth literally fell open, his eyes widening in shock. That's not possible," Walsh finally managed. "We haven't been told about any new chief." "The official announcement is scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow," Cheryl explained, her voice level. "I requested a week to observe the department in the city before formally stepping into the role. The commission agreed to keep it confidential until then." Walsh's face had drained of color. He looked down at her credentials again, then back at her face, as if trying to reconcile this new reality. "You can verify with Mayor Rodriguez or Chairwoman Wilson if you'd like," Cheryl added, pulling out her phone. "I'm happy to call either of them right now." Officer Diaz had stepped back from the passenger window, running a hand through his hair in disbelief. "Chief Dorsey," he said, testing the title. We didn't know." "That was rather the point, Officer Diaz," she replied with a slight smile. "Sometimes the most valuable insights come when people don't know they're being observed." Walsh was still frozen in place, clearly processing the implications of what had just happened, pulling over his new boss on questionable grounds. The things he'd said, the assumptions he'd made, his partner seemed to recover more quickly. "Walsh," Diaz muttered, "give the chief her license back." The prompt seemed to snap Walsh out of his shock. He handed the documents back to Cheryl, his movements stiff and mechanical. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, Chief." "No apology necessary, Officer Walsh," Cheryl replied, taking her license and registration. "You are doing your job as you understand it. That gives me valuable information for moving forward." She started her engine but left the car in park. "I'll see you both at the station tomorrow. After my introduction to the department, I'd appreciate it if you'd both stop by my office. I think we have a lot to discuss about community policing strategies in Riverdale." Walsh nodded wordlessly. Diaz managed a tense "yes, ma'am." As Cheryl drove away, she watched in her rearview mirror as the two officers stood beside their patrol car, apparently too stunned to immediately return to their vehicle. She could only imagine the conversation they were having, and the calls that would soon be flying around the department as word spread. By morning, every officer in Riverdale would know what had happened. The story would likely grow with each retelling, how two officers had pulled over a black woman driving through an upscale neighborhood at night, questioned her presence there, and discovered she was their new boss. It wasn't how Cheryl had planned to introduce herself to the department, but perhaps it was perfect in its own way. There would be no pretending now, no hiding behind polite smiles and professional courtesies. The issues she'd come to address had been laid bare in her very first encounter with Riverdale officers. As she parked outside her apartment building, Cheryl felt a strange mix of emotions: frustration at experiencing yet another biased stop, satisfaction at the officers' reactions when they realized their mistake, and determination to use this moment constructively. She took out her phone and sent a text to Mayor Rodriguez. "Change of plans. I think we should move up tomorrow's announcement. There's been an interesting development." The mayor's response came almost immediately. "What happened?" Cheryl smiled as she typed, "Let's just say I've had my first official interaction with Riverdale PD officers. They don't know it yet, but it was actually their first performance review. Tomorrow would be challenging. There would be embarrassment, defensiveness, and probably resistance. But there would also be an opportunity, a concrete example of exactly why she had been hired and what needed to change." As she prepared for bed, Cheryl thought about Officers Walsh and Diaz, wondering how they were processing tonight's revelation. Would they be angry? Embarrassed? Defensive? Or might this become a moment of genuine reflection for them? Whatever happened next would set the tone for her entire tenure as chief. She needed to be strategic about how she handled the morning's announcement and her first official meeting with the officers who had pulled her over. This wasn't just about embarrassing a couple of officers or making a point. It was about finding a way to transform this encounter into a catalyst for the changes Riverdale desperately needed. Morning light filtered through the blinds as Cheryl stood in front of her closet, considering her outfit more carefully than usual. First impressions mattered, especially today. She chose a charcoal gray suit, professional but not flashy, with a deep blue blouse that brought out the warmth in her skin tone. Her service medals and the gold badge from her previous department completed the look. The reflection in the mirror showed exactly what she wanted to project: competence, authority, and approachability. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mayor Rodriguez. Words already spreading. Officers Walsh and Diaz apparently had quite a story for the night shift. Cheryl wasn't surprised. Police departments ran on gossip as much as coffee. By now, various versions of last night's encounter would be circulating through the ranks. She wondered which narrative was winning: the embarrassing tale of officers who picked the wrong driver to hassle, or something that cast her as the villain, an outsider setting them up to fail. Either way, she was walking into a hornet's nest. The scheduled 9 a.m. introduction had been moved up to 7:30, catching the overlap between night shift and day shift. Maximum attendance, minimum preparation time for anyone planning to avoid her. The police headquarters looked different in daylight than it had from her coffee shop observation post. The 5-story brick building had been constructed in the 1970s, its architecture reflecting that era's belief that civic buildings should project power rather than welcome citizens. She'd already made a mental note to include renovations in her long-term plans. As she approached the front entrance, Cheryl spotted officers Walsh and Diaz getting out of their patrol car in the parking lot. Their shift had technically ended at 7 a.m., but they'd clearly stayed for her introduction. Walsh noticed her and froze momentarily before nodding stiffly in acknowledgement. Diaz, looking like he hadn't slept, managed an awkward wave. Mayor Rodriguez met her at the door, anxiety evident in his hurried greeting. "Chief Dorsey, I'm so sorry about last night. I've spoken with both officers and—" "Please don't apologize," Cheryl interrupted gently. What happened was actually perfect timing. Nothing reveals culture like authentic interaction. The mayor looked uncertain. "You're not angry?" "I'm concerned, but not angry. There's a difference." She checked her watch. "Shall we?" They walked toward the department's largest briefing room, now packed with officers in various states of uniform, some just ending their shifts, others just beginning, and many who'd come in specifically for this meeting. Conversations hushed as she entered, all eyes tracking her progress to the front of the room. In the back corner stood officers Walsh and Diaz. Walsh's expression was carefully neutral, while Diaz looked like he wished the floor would swallow him whole. Scattered throughout the room, Cheryl noted the officers who maintained eye contact with her, versus those who suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. Chairwoman Wilson was already at the podium, waiting to make the official introduction. The commissioner nodded respectfully as Cheryl approached, then turned to address the room. "Good morning. As many of you have already heard, Riverdale Police Department has a new chief effective immediately. The commission conducted an extensive search and unanimously selected Dr. Cheryl Dorsey based on her exceptional record and innovative approaches to community policing." That wasn't entirely true. The vote had been 6-1, but Cheryl appreciated the show of solidarity. "Chief Dorsey brings 20 years of law enforcement experience, multiple commendations for community engagement initiatives, and a doctorate in criminal justice reform. She has our complete confidence and full support." The chairwoman's emphasis on complete confidence and full support was pointed. A message to anyone considering immediate resistance. "I'll now turn the floor over to Chief Dorsey." As Cheryl stepped to the podium, she felt the weight of dozens of evaluating stares. These officers didn't know her, didn't trust her, and many probably already resented her. She needed to acknowledge the elephant in the room while establishing her authority and vision. "Thank you, Chairwoman Wilson." Cheryl surveyed the room slowly, making brief eye contact with as many officers as possible. "I'd like to begin by addressing what some of you already know. Last night I had my first unofficial interaction with 2 Riverdale officers when I was pulled over while driving through the North District." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. In the back, Officer Diaz closed his eyes briefly while Walsh maintained his stoic expression. "I want to be clear about something," Cheryl continued. "I didn't plan that encounter, but I'm not sorry it happened. It gave me valuable insight into how policing happens in Riverdale when supervisors aren't watching, and when officers believe there won't be consequences for cutting corners." The room had gone completely silent now. Some of you are probably wondering if those officers will be disciplined. She paused, letting the question hang. The answer is no. She noted the surprise that crossed several faces, including those of Walsh and Diaz. What happened last night wasn't about 2 individual officers. It was about systemic patterns and ingrained habits that need to be addressed department-wide. Using that encounter as a punishment opportunity would miss the larger point and start my tenure here on exactly the wrong foot. Cheryl stepped away from the podium, preferring to speak without the barrier between herself and the officers. I've read every report, complaint and commendation from the past 5 years. I've studied the demographics of who gets stopped, searched, and arrested in Riverdale versus who lives here. I've spoken with community members, business owners, and local leaders. I know the challenges this department faces, both internally and externally. She moved along the edge of the stage, making the large room feel smaller, more intimate. Some of you are doing excellent work under difficult circumstances. Some of you have ideas for improvement that haven't been heard. Some of you have fallen into patterns of policing that don't serve this community or your fellow officers. And some of you actively resist any change that might make you rethink how you do your job. The bluntness of her assessment caused several officers to shift uncomfortably in their seats. I'm not here to clean house or point fingers. I'm here because I believe in the possibility of better policing. Policing that protects and serves everyone equally, that builds trust rather than fear, and that makes officers proud of their badges rather than defensive about them. Cheryl paused, letting her words sink in. My door is open to every officer with ideas, concerns, or questions. In the coming weeks, I'll be implementing some immediate changes to address the most pressing issues. But the long-term transformation of this department will be a collaborative effort. She returned to the podium for her closing remarks. Officers Walsh and Diaz, she said, looking directly at them in the back of the room. I'd like to see you in my office in 30 minutes. Not for discipline, but because I think we have an opportunity to start something important together. The surprise on their faces was evident. Whatever they had expected, it wasn't this. To everyone else, shift briefings will continue as scheduled. I'll be joining each one over the next few days to meet all of you properly. Thank you for your attention. As the room began to clear, Cheryl could feel the mix of emotions: confusion, curiosity, skepticism, and maybe, from a few, cautious optimism. She accepted handshakes and brief introductions from several senior officers, noting which ones made genuine eye contact and which seemed to be going through the motions. 30 minutes later, she was settling into her new office when a tentative knock came at the door. "Come in," she called. Officers Walsh and Diaz entered, both still in uniform though technically off-duty. Their body language spoke volumes. Walsh stood rigid and formal while Diaz seemed unsure where to put his hands. "Thank you for staying," Cheryl said, gesturing to the chairs across from her desk. "Please sit down." They complied silently, waiting for whatever came next. "I want to start by saying that what happened last night wasn't personal," she began. "I didn't set out to trap you or embarrass you. I was genuinely getting to know the neighborhoods, and you were genuinely doing what you've been trained or accustomed to do." Walsh spoke first, his tone carefully professional. "With all due respect, Chief, we were following standard protocol for night patrols in that district." "Were you?" Cheryl asked. "Let's break it down. You stopped me for a broken tail light that wasn't broken. You questioned my presence in the neighborhood without cause. You attempted to escalate a routine traffic stop to a vehicle exit without justification. If that's standard protocol, then we have identified our first area for improvement." Diaz glanced at his partner, then back to Cheryl. "Chief Dorsey, what exactly do you want from us?" The directness of the question was refreshing. "Right now, your honesty. Last night happened. We can't change it, but we can use it constructively if you're willing." "Honesty about what?" Walsh asked, guardedness still evident in his posture. "About why you really pulled me over. About what assumptions were made. About how stops like that affect community trust. About whether you think last night was good policing." The room fell silent. Walsh stared at a point just above Cheryl's head while Diaz studied his hands. "This isn't a gotcha moment," Cheryl assured them. "What you say in this room stays in this room. I'm offering you both an opportunity to be part of the solution rather than examples of the problem." Diaz spoke first. "It wasn't good policing," he admitted quietly. "We saw an out-of-state plate driving slowly at night. We made assumptions." Walsh shot him a look but remained silent. "And if I had been a college student? Or an elderly woman? Would you have approached the stop the same way?" Cheryl pressed. "Probably not," Diaz acknowledged. Cheryl turned her attention to Walsh, who was still maintaining his rigid posture. Officer Walsh? Your perspective matters too. He finally met her gaze directly. With respect, Chief, I don't think it does. You've already decided what kind of officer I am based on one interaction. Actually, I haven't, Cheryl replied calmly. If I had, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I'd have written you up and moved on. I'm here because I think there's more to both of you than last night's stop, and because I believe meaningful change starts with difficult conversations. Something in her tone must have reached him. Walsh's shoulders relaxed slightly. What do you want us to do? He asked, his voice less defensive now. Cheryl smiled. I want you to help me build a bridge. 6 months passed more quickly than Cheryl could have imagined. The calendar on her office wall was crowded with notes, meetings, and reminders, physical evidence of the whirlwind of changes she'd initiated. Outside her window, autumn had given way to winter and then to spring, bringing new growth to the trees lining the street in front of the station. Inside the department, different kinds of growth were taking root. The morning's leadership meeting had just wrapped up. Seated around the conference table were her newly appointed captains and lieutenants, a diverse group that better reflected Riverdale's population than any previous command staff. Among them sat Brian Diaz, recently promoted to sergeant after showing remarkable dedication to the new community policing initiatives. Anything else before we break? Cheryl asked, glancing around the table. Just the final numbers for the quarterly report, said Captain Lee, sliding a folder across the table. Complaint rates down 37%. Response times improved in all districts, especially the east side. Arrest rates down, but successful prosecution rates up. Cheryl nodded appreciatively. Quality over quantity. Exactly what we've been aiming for. As the room cleared, Sergeant Diaz lingered. Chief, do you have a minute? It's about tonight's community forum. Of course. She gestured for him to sit back down. Having second thoughts about moderating? No, not second thoughts exactly. Diaz's transformation over the past months had been remarkable, from the nervous officer, afraid to contradict his partner, to a confident leader willing to stand before community members who had once distrusted him. Walsh and I were talking, and we thought it might be powerful to open the forum by telling the story of how we met you. The traffic stop. Cheryl raised an eyebrow. That would certainly be a bold way to start. People know pieces of the story already. It's practically department legend now. But we thought hearing it directly, as a way to acknowledge where we started versus where we are now. He shrugged. Might help some of the community members see that change is possible, even with officers they've had negative experiences with. The suggestion touched Cheryl deeply. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined either Walsh or Diaz volunteering to publicly discuss that night. Their willingness to use their own mistakes as a teaching tool spoke volumes about the cultural shift happening within the department. I think it's an excellent idea, she said. Speaking of Walsh, how's he doing with the youth engagement program? Diaz smiled. You wouldn't recognize him. The kids have started calling him Officer Pete. Last week he organized a basketball game between officers and high school students. We lost badly, but the connections made were worth the bruised egos. After Diaz left, Cheryl sat quietly, reflecting on the journey so far. That first conversation with Walsh and Diaz had been the beginning of what she now called her bridge builder strategy. Instead of isolating or punishing officers resistant to change, she'd given them specific roles in the reform process. Walsh and Diaz had become her test case. If she could turn those two around, particularly Walsh with his deeply ingrained habits, she could reach others. The strategy hadn't been without challenges. 3 weeks into her tenure, an anonymous letter had circulated through the department questioning her qualifications and suggesting her appointment was political, correctness gone too far. Some veteran officers had requested transfers. Others had taken early retirement rather than adapt to new accountability measures and community engagement requirements. But for every officer who resisted, others stepped up, relieved to finally have leadership that valued building trust over racking up arrests. Young officers who had entered the profession with ideals intact found their voices. Veterans who had been quietly uncomfortable with departmental practices felt empowered to model better approaches. Cheryl's phone buzzed with a text from Mayor Rodriguez. Have you seen the paper today? She hadn't. Between early meetings and preparation for tonight's forum, she hadn't had time. She quickly pulled up the Riverdale Daily News on her computer. The headline made her pause. Police Department Transformation, 6 months of progress. The article was surprisingly balanced, highlighting both successes and ongoing challenges. It quoted community members who noted improved response times and more respectful interactions. Business owners reported feeling safer, while also noting less harassment of young people in shopping areas. The reporter had even interviewed Walsh, who spoke candidly about his initial skepticism and subsequent change of heart. "I've been an officer for 17 years, he was quoted saying. "I thought I knew everything about policing. Turns out I knew a lot about enforcing laws, but not much about serving communities. The difference matters." A knock at her door interrupted her reading. It was Officer Carmen Valdez, one of her most promising young officers. "Sorry to disturb you, Chief, but there's someone in the lobby asking to speak with you. Says his name is Mr. Washington? He mentioned you might remember him from your childhood neighborhood." Cheryl stood up so quickly she nearly knocked over her coffee. "Mr. Washington is here? Please bring him to my office right away." Minutes later, she was embracing an elderly man whose kind face was lined with decades of experience, but whose eyes remained bright and alert. James Washington had been their block's unofficial grandfather, the man whose unfair treatment by police had first planted the seeds of Cheryl's career path. "Look at you," he said, holding her at arm's length to take in her uniform with its chief's insignia. "Your daddy would have been so proud." Her father had passed away during her second year on the force, heart attack taking him before he could see how far she would go. The mention of him brought a momentary tightness to her throat. "What brings you to Riverdale, Mr. Washington? It's a long way from home." He smiled, settling into the chair she offered. "Been following your career, young lady. When I read about your appointment here, I told my daughter I needed to see it for myself. She lives about an hour away, so we made a day trip of it." They spent the next half hour catching up, Mr. Washington sharing news of old neighbors and Cheryl updating him on her journey since leaving their community. As their conversation wound down, his expression grew more serious. "That day they had me against my car for no good reason. You were watching from the corner." Cheryl nodded, surprised he'd noticed her all those years ago. "I saw something in your face then," he continued. "Not just anger, but something else. Like you were taking mental notes, figuring things out. I told your daddy later. That girl's going to change things someday. And look at you now." Before leaving for the day, Cheryl invited Mr. Washington to attend the evening's community forum, which he eagerly accepted. Walking him to the lobby, they passed the wall display she'd installed her first month. Photographs showing officers engaged with community members, teaching classes, playing with children, helping elderly residents. Alongside these were framed copies of the department's new mission statement and code of conduct, developed collaboratively with both officers and community representatives. That evening, the community center was packed for the quarterly forum, a far cry from the sparsely attended, tension-filled meetings of previous administrations. The audience reflected Riverdale's diversity: elderly residents and teenagers, business owners and community activists, people from every neighborhood and background. Sergeant Diaz opened the session as planned, recounting the traffic stop with remarkable candor. Walsh joined him, adding his perspective on how that encounter had forced him to confront biases he hadn't acknowledged. When they introduced Chief Dorsey, the applause was genuine. Standing at the podium, Cheryl spotted Mr. Washington in the third row, beaming with pride. Next to him sat Thomas from the coffee shop, who had become a regular.